Encore on Midlands 103. Your arts and entertainment for the Midlands. Midlands 103.
James Patrick, or Jim Bruce, is a writer, blogger, podcaster and historian. He is the author of Ireland's Hope, The Peculiar Theories of James Fintan Lalor. And I spoke to him recently following the launch of the book at Tenakel House in County Laois. And I asked him, as a Dubliner, what in the world possessed him to investigate the life and writings of James Fintan Lalor. This is what he had to say.
Well, it was part of a course I did in Irish history, and I was looking for a subject that would, I suppose, get me through a course that would be of interest to me and to the world at large. And I tried various topics, but none of them seemed to have legs, as they say, until I stumbled upon this man, James Fintan Lalor, whom I hadn't really heard of. But I came across him through the writings of a man named Raymond Crotty, who was a much more recent figure who I was looking into at the time. And he seemed to endorse this man's teachings in relation to nationality and land and so on. So I thought I'd have a look at him. And I looked into Lalor and found somebody who was rather neglected and someone whom I thought I could spend a bit of time investigating, which is what I did. And the result was the book Ireland's Hope.
Those of us who live in Laois, or many people who live in Laois, are familiar with James Fintan Lalor, not least because his name is given to the main boulevard in Portlaoise, James Fintan Lalor Avenue. But for people who are outside the county, why should they be interested in James Fintan Lalor? What has he ever done for them? How has his memory lived on in a way that affects us?
Well, his memory, I suppose, is more the influence he had on later people who are much better known than he was, than what he actually achieved during his own short life. He was only 42 when he died, and he died before the famine was really over. He died in 1849 in a kind of a rundown garret, I think, in Dublin, and was buried in an unmarked grave in Glasnevin. But his memory was resurrected many decades later by some of his former companions like Charles Gavin Duffy and John O'Leary, and they kind of brought him back into public attention. And he had a huge influence on Patrick Pearse, and apparently Patrick Pearse, one of his last acts before leading the Rising of 1916 was to visit the National Library in town in Dublin and read Lalor's last published essay called Clearing Decks, and that seems to have been a huge spur to his own decision to take the militant route. But he wrote extensively about Lalor in his last few essays. This is Pearse now. And James Connolly was also considerably influenced by Lalor, as were people like De Valera and Raymond Crotty, as I mentioned. Michael Davitt was a huge devotee of Lalor's. So these men are probably more famous generally than Lalor himself. So it's really his legacy, I think, that has had the impact rather than anything spectacular that he did himself while he was alive.
And he was unusual in his time during his life. Just give us a little bit about where he came from and how that informed, I suppose, the fairly radical ideas that he had for ostensibly a quiet man from the middle of County Laois.
Yeah, he did come from nowhere. He wasn't really that well known until he contacted the Young Ireland movement, who were at that stage in the process of breaking free from Daniel O'Connell's Repeal Association and setting up a kind of a younger, more dynamic alternative to O'Connell and I suppose what they would have called Old Ireland. So these were the Young Ireland people. So we thought that would be an opportunity for him, James Fintan Lalor, to get his ideas across to the wider public through these better known and better established figures like Charles Gavin Duffy and John Mitchell. So that's what he did, and he contacted them and got some space in the best-selling Nation newspaper at the time to basically promote his own thinking about nationality, Ireland, and particularly the land question, which was a vexed question at the time. And his ideas were much more radical than anything which even the Young Ireland people were prepared to promote at the time. And I think he helped move them a little bit, well, more than a little bit in some cases, to the radical end of the spectrum. within about a year of him making their acquaintance for the first time. And John Mitchell in particular was a beneficiary of Lalor's thinking. And obviously Mitchell outlived Lalor and went on to promote his own brand of Lalor ideas through his own newspapers and his own kind of media, particularly when he went to the States. So Lalor was a well-to-do member of a large middle-class Catholic farming family near Abbeyleix. And Pat Lalor, his father, was a well-known figure, much better known than James Fintan was at that stage, because he had been instrumental in fighting against the tithe measure back in the 1830s, and had led the county, if not more widely, the campaign against the tithes successfully. As a result of that, he was elected an MP and went to London for a few years as a member of Parliament for Laois. And so it was quite a well-known figure. And James Fintan was his eldest son. I think one of about 10 or 11 children that Pat Lalor had. So he was set to inherit the farm, I suppose, and to become his father's heir apparent, until he became radicalized himself, mainly by the famine, and was essentially ostracized by his family, and as I say, ended up in an unmarked grave in Glasnevin.
Because his politics was very opposite to, I suppose, the politics that his father had to espouse as in his own political position.
Yeah, Pat Lalor was a great admirer and a follower of Daniel O'Connell, and James Fintan Lalor, I think it's fair to say he despised Daniel O'Connell. He called him a traitor in one of his letters to the Young Ireland movement. He certainly didn't pull his punches and had no truck at all with the whole repeal movement, which transformed itself into the Home Rule movement later in the century. He wasn't satisfied with anything less than complete and utter independence of the country. And in that regard, he was at odds with most people, even in the Young Ireland movement. He was more in tune with the people who had led the 1798 rebellion and who wanted complete separation from Britain. And that had been kind of modified by O'Connell and had become more popular in the country. But he still stuck with his belief that Ireland could only be a true nation if it separated itself completely from Great Britain and took control of the land. So he was very much at odds with his family and with the wider nationalist public as well. And so he didn't really fit in well with the mainstream nationalist movement at the time.
If he had lived, Jim, do you think that this would have been a different country?
Well, it's interesting because Michael Davitt, in his own kind of memoirs late in his own life, not long before he died, lamented the fact that Lalor himself hadn't been more successful in leading a revolution at the time of the famine. Now, it would have been very difficult for him to do that, but if he had done, according to Davitt, it would have transformed the country. It would have obviously brought independence to Ireland at a much earlier stage. It would have saved an awful lot of anguish and heartbreak and death and misery and decades of it that followed until eventually we got our independence in 1922. So if he had lived, perhaps, I don't know, maybe he mightn't have led a revolution, but he might have been more successful in preserving his own thinking on paper. There was an awful lot of gaps in the record when I was doing my research, and I had to piece together what fragments of his writings remained. So I think he might have left a better record of his thinking, might have developed his thinking the way, people like Charles Gavin Duffy and John O'Leary, who lived, for many, many decades afterwards, were able to do in their own writings. And basically Lalor had to rely on those who were well disposed towards him to preserve his memory, which some people did, like Duffy and John O'Leary and his great friend Thomas Clark Luby, and they managed to keep his memory alive until the likes of Connolly and Pearse caught up and realised this man was a bit of a prophet and a bit of a genius himself.
Can I ask you then finally, when you describe him as a prophet and a genius, and the piece of work that you have done is the first full scholarly investigation of his writings, are we on the road to seeing somebody like James Fintan Lalor being recognised and appreciated and remembered outside of that beautiful Rory Breslin sculpture that's outside County Hall in Portlaoise?
Well, I'd like to think so. That was one of the reasons why I thought the book might have an effect, because I was amazed at how little, if anything, he featured in any kind of intellectual history of Irish nationalism in the 19th century. He's never mentioned. The only places he's mentioned in are general historians of the period saying how he failed to lead a revolution during the famine, and also that he was a great influence on John Mitchell. But other than that, he's largely forgotten. And I think only for Pearse in particular, and maybe De Valera, who are much better known figures, I think we wouldn't remember him at all. And I think, apart from anything else, his teachings have an awful lot to say to us today. I don't think he's a man whose time came and went with a famine. I think what he left behind, little as it is, has a lot to teach us still. And someone like Crotty, who wrote extensively himself about the Irish economy in the 80s and 90s, felt that Lalor could teach us still a lot. So I think the first step would be to have him recognised as a great thinker in Irish history, and then for someone to maybe take his writings and see what can we still learn from these writings and maybe apply to our situation in Ireland today.
Save it. And that is Jim Bruce, who is the author of Ireland's Hope, The Peculiar Theories of James Fintan Lalor. You can get it at Jim's own website. There's lots of details there, and that in terms of how you can get it, it's at jpbruce.ie.